Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on. Bizarre Break-In by Communist Nymph. This is one I've debated ever speaking about openly, mostly because of how strange the whole thing was. It happened 7 years ago back in my hometown in California. I'm a 24-year-old female and was 17 at the time and living with my mom and older sister in a tiny condo. We were a pretty devoutly Catholic family at the time and would attend Holy Adoration on Friday nights at our parish. Before we went, we'd order some pizza and chicken wings, but the delivery was pretty late, so we left without really touching our food, so we would put it all away to eat after adoration. When we got home, we discovered our back door had been left ajar. We began arguing over who left the door open. When we stepped inside, we found a pretty strange scene. The pizza and chicken boxes were all sitting on the kitchen floor, neatly stacked on top of each other. We assumed our very food-motivated dog had something to do with it, still not fully aware of the situation. When picking up the boxes, we noticed bites had been taken from everything. I went into the living room and found a pile of pistachio shells sitting in the middle of the room. Now was about the time when we got scared, because no dog would be able to shell pistachios and pile them up in that way. My mom called a family friend over to help sort out what was going on. When he arrived, he seemed terrified and went home to go grab his gun and was planning on staying the night in case anything more happened. By the time he went to get the gun, I had gone upstairs to go to bed. I was tired, scared, and hungry, because my food I had anxiously been waiting to eat had seemingly been devoured by someone or something. Back then, my bed was pretty elevated off the ground and neatly made. My mom was with me as I was peeling the covers back to climb in and go to sleep. However, when I lifted up one of the decorative pillow shams, I found a chicken wing with one bite taken out of it on top of my pillow. Me and my mom were silent and just stared at each other in disbelief, not sure what kind of a sick joke this person thought they were pulling. Fast forward to me moving away to college a year later. I was in Kansas at a tiny liberal arts school hanging out with some friends in the dorms. My phone started ringing and I didn't answer it. It rang again, so I looked at the screen to see it had no caller ID. I picked it up, and a male voice that sounded familiar enough casually addressed me by name and asked how I was doing. I asked who it was, got no response, just heavy breathing. I asked again who it was and started to hear a bit of giggling and what sounded like, well, a man getting himself off. He finally answered in a much more serious tone that he knew me and would only ever reveal his identity if I helped him. I panicked and hung up. Seconds later, he called again, taunting me. It was strange. I knew the voice, but I couldn't place it. I ran out of my friend's dorm into the bathroom that he had excused himself to before the initial call came through, and I told him something weird was happening. The calls kept coming, and I rejected them every time. And finally, my friend took the phone from my hand and told the guy to fuck off, that I wasn't interested in whatever it was I needed to help him with. The nasty sounds continued on the other line with some moaning, and then silence. I've always wondered if the two were connected. I reported the incident to my college and local police, and they were completely at a loss. All that could be offered was a student escort to walk me to my classes in case I really was being watched, as the guy on the phone seemed to imply. When cops tried to trace calls and track the towers they had pinged off of, it was many different locations, none near me. I still feel like maybe the person who had entered my home and apparently ate my food in my bed might be the one behind those calls. Clash of Personalities by Bibliothecarius. In the very late 90s, I was renting the basement of my parents' fifth American home. They did move a lot. I was doing this while I sorted out my post-bachelor's degree plans. I'd been accepted to grad school to earn a master's in literature, but I needed to find a place to live in Worcester, Massachusetts. I woke up one morning in late June, certain I'd find my apartment that day. The university phoned me about 30 minutes later to ask me if I was interested in seeing a newly available apartment 2 blocks from the English department and 3 blocks from the center of campus. I said I'd see it before lunch, as it was less than an hour's drive from my parents' house. Apartment 1A turned out to be a fairly roomy ground-floor apartment facing the street. It had ridiculously high ceilings, 9 or 10 feet high, and a minimum of 2 windows per room. It appeared to be light and lovely, and best of all, for a cash-strapped grad student, I could afford the rent on a TA's stipend. Originally, the structure had been built as a 3-story triple-decker apartment building with a single staircase serving all 3 floors. However, someone had built an extension toward the back of the lot, doubling the size of the building with a second front door and an independent staircase. Someone else had further subdivided the interiors to create additional smaller apartments out of adjacent rooms from both parts of the structure. Instead of 2 apartments on each level, there were now 3. My apartment door was the only ground-level apartment which opened onto the first staircase. 1B and 1C opened onto the second staircase. Both sections of the building had front doors that opened onto a single pathway, which was at right angles to the street. One peculiar effect of the extensive remodeling was that there was one enclosed narrow porch which also opened onto the pathway, right next to the 2 steps down to the pavement. The only way onto the 3x9 porch from the inside of the building was from my apartment's dead-bolted back door, located in my bedroom. I used the porch to store my garbage and recycling as it was so close to the road, and the door from the porch to the street had sliding bolts at the top and bottom which could only be operated from inside the porch. Every time I went to class, I had to go out of the apartment's entrance in my living room, proceed out the front door, walk along the path past my own back door, and then step onto the sidewalk. Inside the building, there were many odd room arrangements. For example, there was a door off the kitchen which looked like it should have led to a pantry. However, it was a windowless bathroom about 4 feet wide and 12 feet long. It resembled a converted hallway, and thanks to the internal subdividing, it was underneath the door to 2B, the second story's middle apartment. In my bathroom, the sink and wall-mounted mirror were immediately next to the door on the left wall. Then there was the chimney for 1B's fireplace, then the toilet, a 3x4-foot open space with a laundry drying rack took up half of that area, and then a 4-foot square shower at the end. The light fixture and extractor fan was close to the shower above the laundry rack. Due to some early childhood trauma, I was always wary of bathrooms, and that had happened to me from an early age. I didn't like the bathroom in this new apartment at all, but I convinced myself that it was my childhood fears playing up, and that I only had to tolerate the inconvenient layout for a couple of years, and then I'd leave. I made myself believe that there was nothing in the bathroom, and that trapped feeling that I had was a result of the lack of windows. After I'd moved in, I discovered that leaving the blinds open in my living room meant that anyone over 3 feet tall who walked along the sidewalk looked in my windows. I closed the louvered blinds and left them closed for weeks at a time, just for a sense of privacy. That may have contributed to my depression, as did being a day's travel away from my fiancée. I only felt depressed when I was in that apartment, though. More of a general sense of gloom began to set in, incrementally building to a dread of returning home. While the rooms still looked spacious, bright, and airy, I had the peculiar sensation that the apartment was trying hard to look that way, in spite of the heavy atmosphere which seemed to be pouring very slowly out of the bathroom and into the rest of the apartment. I had lived in 1A for about 8 months when the tapping in the kitchen began. It was late at night, and I was on the sofa watching a movie with the kitchen doorway behind my right shoulder. The rhythm was a simple 9 beats, as though drummed out on a wooden surface using alternating fingers in an impatient manner. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5. I stopped my movie and thought, what the hell was that noise? Did it come from my bathroom or my kitchen? 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5. The first and last beats seemed more pronounced than the others, but I couldn't tell if it was because they were really louder, or because each had been preceded or followed by a very still silence. I got up from the sofa, walked deliberately to the middle of the kitchen, and pulled the cord to turn on the light. I don't know what I expected to find, but it was only my slightly untidy kitchen. I started to look around for a possible rodent invader. As I looked toward the cabinets and sink, there was a 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 tapping on the refrigerator's door to my left. I turned slowly toward the fridge, scrutinized the assorted bills and postcards magnetized to it, and then I looked down at the gap between the left side of the fridge and the wall. There was nothing but ugly linoleum. The sound resumed with a wooden resonance, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5. I could tell it was now coming from the baker's rack to the right of the fridge because of the toaster oven's clattering accompaniment to the last few wooden beats. I moved to my right and started to look around on the baker's rack to see if I could see what was making the noise. I slid open one of the wooden drawers, seeking a simple explanation, hoping I'd misinterpreted the source of the sound. As the first drawer contained no likely candidates loitering in the cutlery, I slid it shut and put my hand on the second drawer, when the metal stovetop behind me reverberated to the now irritating rhythm, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5. I hesitantly tiptoed toward the stove, feeling like the idiot character in a horror movie who wouldn't listen to the audience's warnings to leave. There was a pan on the stovetop, but it was empty. Likewise, the tea kettle yielded no clues. The pilot light was on, and there was no scent of a natural gas leak. The search had become more exasperating than enlightening, so I decided I was going to leave the kitchen light on and return to the living room. As I straightened up and faced the living room doorway, the metal sink behind me tapped out 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5. I spun around, determined to catch the pest in the act. I peered over the rim of the sink, trying to identify the cause of the rhythm, when something used as much energy as it could muster to kick the metal side of my stove with a bang. The second thought which ran through my head was, I think it wanted to frighten me, because this thought was still trying to organize itself into a coherent analytical statement. It had no chance whatsoever of catching up with my adrenaline-fueled verbal indignation as I lost my temper. I try very, very hard to be a patient person, because when I'm angry, my attitude is that nuclear option. It's a fine starting point that anything left standing within the blast radius is a valid target. I recall that my reaction began with, "How dare you?" I know that my tirade included casting aspersions upon the moral character of the entity, speculations about the cheap promiscuity of the entity's mother, indicating whether its own anatomy the entity should place its hand in order to tap its next rhythm, and my opinion of spirits who wanted to haunt my apartment without even pretending to be helpful. I informed it that it was haunting a sadly decrepit tenement building in a poor neighborhood, that the heyday of Worcester's economy had occurred about 110 years earlier, and that those conditions meant that I was shouting at the supernatural equivalent of dry rot fungus. I had gone into the kitchen because I had thought it was in need of help, not that it was engaged in a feeble attempt to scare me. Even with the help of the depressed atmosphere, no invisible appliance-tapping absurdity was going to make me feel afraid in my apartment, and I wanted it gone. I included several profanity-laden instructions as to how it was to remove itself, suggested that it try to locate its dignity, and issued dire warnings of the measures I would take if it resurfaced while I was still residing there. Not surprisingly, it left. it took most of the oppressive atmosphere with it, too. I've been told by my family, my friends, and on one notable occasion by a stranger, that for a 5'6", 140-pound person, I can be pretty terrifying. This is not a character trait I like, as it can take hours and sometimes days for me to regain my composure, and I prefer to be a happy, enthusiastic, and pleasant person. But when I'm outraged, I focus intently on the cause, throw my internal filters to the off position, and spin up the dynamo on my vocabulary, crank my volume, and picture what I'm about to do to the person or group of people right in front of me, feel crackling ice-cold fury crawl up my spine, and let her rip. The fact that I've done this on more than one occasion to living people and to otherwise terrifying guard dogs, without retaliation from anyone, would suggest that the level of anger I can achieve, when justified, is effective. This encounter suggests that it also may be effective in surprising otherworldly entities. About 2 months after that event, I was leaving my living room and entered my darkened bedroom. The streetlights outside were casting shadows of tree branches against the closed shades, but there was a very solid dark shadow on the pull-down shade on the door which led to the enclosed porch. The shadow was just under 6 feet tall, and it appeared to be the outline of a man of stocky build, wearing a pork pie hat, the kind Art Rooney wore in The Honeymooners. For the shadow of where it was, the individual casting it would have needed to be standing on the porch, looking at the locked door. That would have meant breaking in via the external door, releasing the 2 unreachable sliding bolts, then simply standing there waiting to be noticed. I'd been reading, so the noise of an intruder would have alerted me immediately, and I was irritated by the shadows loitering on the porch, so I began with the slow voice I reserved for the heart of thinking. I explained this very clearly last time, you half-wit, and I snapped open the rolling blind. Nothing was there. I was bemused by my inability to see a manifestation of whoever had been casting the visible shadow, but I continued to inform them that banished meant the entirety of the apartment, including the porch. Just because there was a locked door, it didn't mean it was allowed to loiter outside. After a prolonged stream of invective at the incompetent attempt to locate a loophole in my previous instructions, I explained that it had all the intelligence of a brick, but none of the usefulness, and that I was banishing it onto the fires of hell for haunting me when I was preparing a lesson on Shakespeare's Henry V, Act 1. At that time, I began some serious soul-searching about my slow drift into agnosticism, but this entity had really pissed me off. So taking refuge in my religious upbringing and compelling it to suffer in hellfire, it seemed like a reasonable reaction. Now, I wonder if damning it to hell, should such a location exist, was overreacting a little. But, on the plus side, either it did as I instructed, or it huddled away and waited another 2 years for me to move out, because it never showed its face, its tapping, or its shadow again. Many people claim they're haunted. My experience actually took place right in Gallup, on the east side of the city, near a very small reservation. My best friend visited her sister every weekend who lived in the low rental apartments on the east side. Right across from these apartments was an elementary school, the one I actually attended when I was a little girl. During those weekends, I would spend the night with my friend at her sister's apartment. At night, when there was absolutely nothing to do and the kids and parents were asleep, we'd go outside to the park that was right there in the middle of the apartments and just chill. One night, we became so bored we actually took off walking, and I'd say it was about 2 a.m. We were used to being up so late we were wide awake, of course like any teenage girl wanting to stay up late. Well, we walked behind the apartments where there was no light and tons of bushes and prairie dog holes in the ground. As we were walking, I sensed that someone was staring at us or following us. I'm very sensitive to these kinds of things, so usually when I sense someone is looking at me or following me, I'm right. So I turned around to look, and nothing was there. As I turned to look forward, my friend suddenly grabbed my arm and said in a scared whisper, "Oh my God, what was that?" I looked into the darkness and saw nothing. The wind was slightly blowing that night, and there were a few trees ahead of us, so I passed it off as the wind moving the leaves. I told her, "It's just the wind, dude, chill out," and we kept walking. But as I looked again, I saw what looked like a black figure moving through the trees. I stopped and said, I think it might be a drunk crashing out back there for the night." Just so I wouldn't scare the crap out of my friend, I kept a calm voice, which was awfully hard for me to do because I sensed that this thing in the trees wasn't a nice personality. So I asked her, "Do you want to go back home?" And she said, "No, we're almost to the store. Let's just keep going." But as we kept walking, we heard movement in the trees. We started walking faster, like power walking. I heard something behind us and I looked, and it looked like a wounded or hurt dog. I wasn't really scared because where I live there's a lot of that. But what I heard next stopped me dead in my tracks and paralyzed me from my legs up. I heard this dog moan and growl at the same time, as if it wanted me for a midnight snack. I literally couldn't move, and my friend was trying to distract me, saying, come on, we gotta run." But her yelling sounded distant, as if I had gone deaf or if she was very far away. I had made eye contact with this thing, and I knew that that was a bad decision. I closed my eyes and said a short prayer without even thinking. I turned around and ran for my life with my friend close by my side. I tried not to look behind us, but something was telling me to look. So I did glance behind us and saw a man running for us. But he wasn't just running. He was on his hands and knees. I screamed, and my friend joined in only because I scared her when I yelled. We ran faster. We finally got to the road where there was light and cars passing. We had run for about 7 minutes straight and were completely out of breath, and I remember our sides aching and cramping. We stopped to catch our breath, and I turned to look behind us again and saw the man, way in the distant darkness, running back to where we had come from. We hadn't walked even 2 minutes and finally got to the store. And the lady behind the counter gave us a weird look and asked us, "Are you girls okay?" We replied out of breath, "Yeah, just a little night run." I could tell she didn't believe us, so she asked, "Did you girls run from the apartments?" And I answered, "Yeah, why?" And she said, "Oh, are you girls sure you're okay?" We looked at each other, and my friend told her, "Well, not really. We just had this weird encounter with something, and we don't know what it is or who it was." The lady said, "You girls just ran from a skinwalker. Whoever it was always chases someone he catches walking the road at night. You girls are lucky you made it this far." As if we weren't shaken up already, what she had just told us added to it. We didn't have any money, but she offered us a bottle of water and a ride back home. She closed the store down and did give us that ride, and as we passed the bushes and trees we had just come from, we all had definitely seen something running, but the lady told us to ignore it and close our eyes. We finally entered the apartment complex, and she asked us, "Which apartment is yours?" And we told her. As we were getting out of the car, she said, "You girls stay home at night now. There's no need for you two young girls to be running around at 2 a.m. Keep yourselves safe, you hear?" We nodded and said goodbye and thank you. After that night, we never left the apartment complex past 12. To this day, I'm still shook up about what I experienced that night, and I also still don't know what it was that followed us. The figure Submitted by Nash. Before I start, I'd like to say that no one ever believes me. This happened about 2 months ago. I just shifted into my new house and I'd been seeing things. I was home alone because my brother was out and my parents were at their office. I started taking out my dinner as I heard the doorbell ring, and I was instructed to never open the door for anyone. When I checked the cameras and no one was there, I went closer to the door to see if I could hear something. As I went there, I heard weird sorts of whispers, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw something creeping from the ceiling and just lurking there. I slowly looked up. My eyes and my brain, I don't even know, could barely make out what it was. But all I knew was that it was darker than a shadow and had skinny long arms and legs. I felt its presence there. All I could do was slowly back up to my phone, getting out of its sight. Reaching for my phone, I called my dad and freaked out. For some reason, he believed me and didn't think I was lying, unlike the rest of my family who just thought my brain made it up from all the movies that I'd watched. And it kind of makes sense to believe that I am lying because I am also pretty young. But, please, anyone out there, let me know if you've had an experience like this too. Friend Who Was in Love With Me by Kitty Cat. Trigger warning for assault. This happened over 10 years ago, but I still think about how close I came to dying. I was already with my future husband when I met his cousin, and we had a lot in common. We both struggled with addiction and anorexia. We talked on the phone and met up to eat and see a movie. But then he kissed me in his car, so I decided it was best if we stopped talking. I told my future husband about the kiss, and he was understanding. I didn't tell him that his cousin got extremely upset over me turning him down. Some time passed, and we started meeting up as friends. Since we were both starving ourselves, we always went to the same place. But after a couple of times, I felt like it wasn't healthy for either of us to meet up. He asked me to meet one last time, and I stupidly said yes. We went to our place, and during dinner he was talking about his apartment and job, how happy he could make me. I got uncomfortable and asked him to drive me home. It was really late, and instead of driving me home, he drove to a forest preserve. It was pitch black because all the lights were off. I immediately felt uneasy. We were alone in the parking lot, and I had a horrible feeling at that point that something was going to happen. He parked and turned off the car, then looked at me and said we were meant for each other. I didn't want to upset him, so I just said that he knew I was engaged and that we were just friends. He had a history of violence, so I was terrified. He started getting really upset and almost crying. He said that he loved me, and then he put his arm around my neck and held his arm down really hard on the right side of it. His arm was around my neck, and I'd been looking straight ahead when suddenly I woke up to a police officer at his window. The officer was asking if I was okay. I was really scared and confused. I had some vomit on my shirt, and I'd wet my pants. This cousin had pressed down on my carotid artery for long enough that it knocked me out. He had been a wrestler in high school. He was telling the officer we were fine and that I was drunk. He got a ticket, but I was too afraid to say anything because if he was arrested, my now husband's family would have blamed me. At least that's what I thought. I told the officer I was fine, but I wanted to go home now. I thought if I said that in front of the officer, this cousin would drive me home because the cop took our names and I knew he wouldn't risk trying something else. So he drove me home and didn't say anything. I don't know if he was trying to kill me or just got so upset that he went way overboard. Regardless, he almost did kill me, and it really fucked me up. A person doesn't vomit and wet themselves after a neck compression, unless they almost died. I told my now husband, but not right away, because I felt like it was partly my fault for meeting up with his cousin. I only saw him a couple of more times during the holidays, and then he stopped coming around. But he didn't dare speak to me after what he did. If that officer hadn't shown up that night, I don't know if I'd be here. An Australian Tinder Swindler by Mind Odd. I'm sharing this so hopefully no one else has to deal with this flea of a human. It's going to be a wild ride, so grab your popcorn and get comfy. Back in June of 2022, I met Wilton Wallace on Hinge. I'm from Victoria, Australia, and he was from Queensland, but was working in Victoria. He was 28 at the time, I was 24. We hit it off, and within a day of chatting, he asked me to meet him in the city for drinks. He seemed friendly and cute, so why not get dressed up and give him a chance? Funnily enough, my spidey senses were tingling already, but I just thought it was the usual nerves of a first date. I should have trusted my gut, but he hadn't given me any red flags yet. He met me at Flinders Street Station. My first impression was that he dressed really nice. Suit and long coat, clearly took pride in his looks. Instantly, he was super affectionate, way more than I'm used to. He kissed my cheek, picked me up, squeezed the crap out of me, and we were hand in hand from the get-go. Although I was taken aback, he was of Brazilian descent, and I know their culture can be quite forward. I wasn't overly alarmed, but this was within 10 seconds of meeting. We decided to go for drinks, and he recommended a very well-known fancy bar. I'm just a nurse, so it was way above my pay grade, but he said he would like to cover the whole night. It became apparent very quickly he was super chivalrous, charming, and a sweet talker. It felt like a soppy 2000s rom-com. I can't lie. He was super open about his life, and because he was, so was I. We had so much in common, and everything felt just right. Makes me want to gag now that I know the real him. And if it feels too good to be true, it probably is. Basically, the life story he threw up all over me was that he was born in Brazil. His parents had a family business and were well off, but lost it somehow. I think he said his dad died. Rest in peace, Dad. His mom couldn't afford to care for him and his 4 sisters alone, so she gave him up for adoption and he moved to Portugal. I guess he was the runt of the litter because she kept the 4 girls. So, he grew up in Portugal from about 5 until he was 17, when he decided to move back to his biological mother. He said his Portuguese family was lovely, but incredibly religious, and he didn't like the constraints, arranged marriages, and no boinking before marriage type deals. So at 17, he moved back to Brazil and built his relationship with his biological mother, and eventually he decided to move to Australia. He moved over to study some aerodynamic bullshit degree for some career I didn't give a flying fuck about. Fast forward 11 years to 2022, and now he works in Queensland as some manager for shipping companies and flies to and from Melbourne for work every few weeks. Now you're up to speed with that crock of shit, so let's get back to the date. I had a traumatic upbringing. Neglect, poverty, being raised by grandparents, and so on. So hearing his story really touched me. The man had me in the palm of his slimy hands. I felt at times he was cocky and had an ego on him, but he even mentioned that he could come across cocky and reassured me that that's how some people perceived him. But he's not at all. So clearly someone's pulled him up from being an arrogant twat before. The date was progressing, and he was ticking so many boxes. We spoke about how I loved to dance and always wanted to learn salsa, So he suggested a studio that did weekend night classes, but it had sold out. So he asked if I'd go back to his place just to hang out. I don't know what this man put in my drink, not literally FYI, but my common sense was gone. I told him I needed to go home before midnight and was only coming over to talk. Anyway, we got to his apartment, and like the scene from Crazy Stupid Love, he lit candles, put on salsa music, and poured a heavy glass of red for us, and asked if he could teach me how to salsa in his tiny living room. Like, was I Kate Hudson on How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days? I obliged because my fanny flutters were in full control of my functioning at that point. We ended up making out, and things got hot and heavy, but I stuck to my guns and didn't let him pass my chastity belt. I mean, don't get me wrong. I have had one-night stands before, but I had turned a new leaf, and my rule was now a 3-date minimum. Long story short, but not short at all, we ended up falling asleep together, and I was fully clothed. How about that? We woke up the next morning, and he took me out for breakfast before ordering me an Uber home. Keep in mind, that was the one and only time I had physically met him, and it was PG rated. A few days later, things were getting weird. He started making grandiose gestures and love-bombing. Without asking, he bought me lingerie. He didn't know my size and had never seen me in lingerie. He bought me jewelry for my birthday just 1 week after we met, and then the grand prize, an all-inclusive holiday to Queensland. I said yes because YOLO, right? Like, literally, I might die, but at least my tombstone would say I was living my best life. He told me on the trip that we'd go to a private restaurant that his friend owned, go on a helicopter ride, and cruise on a yacht amongst a bunch of other completely insane things. He paid for the flights and told me to not bring lingerie because he had that covered. My red flag alarms were going off at this point. Like, is he a sugar daddy, or am I about to be trafficked in the lingerie and jewelry he had just bought me? I mean, think about it. Dude works for a shipping company. Perfect way to ship me off to the market. At that point, my stomach was turning and I was getting sus. I realized I hadn't really done much digging on him, and if I was going interstate with this schmoozy wet sock, I needed to know everything. I spent hours with my housemate investigating. His Facebook was on total lockdown, and this was before you could lock your profile, and his Insta had no signs of family. He barely had any tagged photos with people, and the photos he did have were from years ago in Brazil. All the photos he had were just him solo and traveling, so I started questioning everything. Was his name even Wilton Wallace? It didn't sound Brazilian or Portuguese. It sounded more like Donald Duck or Chuck E. Cheese to me. So we searched his number on my bank app using PayID, and lo and behold, W. Viega dos Santos came up, changed for anonymity. I was shitting bricks. Like, who the fuck was this toenail that I'd been wasting my time with? So I went deeper. I was going through all of his Instagram followers looking for any resemblance of him. I found a mutual friend in the deep dark cave I'd gotten myself into, and there it was, a group photo of him from around 2016, holding a Brazilian woman that looked about 35, and the comments mentioned, "Love you both, can't wait to see you two again." I couldn't confirm if they were married, but that's where my money was. I dug some more to find out who she was, but I couldn't find anything. I had a lead on what her name might be, so I headed to Google and searched both her name and his Viega dos I'm a fucking liar name. After sifting through countless pages I couldn't read because they were in Spanish and poorly translated, I found a settlement document. It was a civil dispute about a debt, but both their full names were there. To my delight, his full name in the case was Wilton Wallace Viega dos Santos. I don't blame him for going by the easiest of the 5 names, but one truth doesn't fix a truck of lies. So now I was thinking that I'd gone mad and overthinking. I mean, maybe he's just divorced and doesn't post a lot. Nope. Whilst doing our investigations, I asked him to send his passport so my friends had his details when I went to Queensland to be safe. He sent me his passport after hours of waiting and had blacked out info and covered his face. The dumb fuck didn't cover his date of birth well enough, and because of that, would you look at that? This absolute toad was born in 1986, making him 36. Now I saw through his bullshit, but wanted to flip the game for a little while. I had to do it for the plot. I confronted him about it, and he made up some shit about how when he was registered in Portugal, they stuffed up the date. I didn't know a 5-year-old could look 13, but there you have it. Over the next few weeks, he kept canceling and changing Queensland plans days before each rescheduled flight. There was always another issue. I went along with it. I had no intention of going, but wanted to see his cunning plot come to fruition. Maybe it wasn't trafficking. Maybe he was going to magically lose all his money and get cancer and need my help to survive. And then I got a message that broke the camel's back. His grandma in Portugal was sick, so he had to fly there ASAP. I literally laughed when I read it. I was super short and apathetic with him. The next day, Grandma died of a stroke. Boo-hoo. Some people may think my digging went a bit too far at that point, but I ended up messaging the woman from the Instagram photo and legal document because I just had a horrible gut feeling there was more to all of this, and I was sick of the games. It definitely felt like I was crossing a line, but I had to know. She ended up messaging me back that she unfortunately did know him and wanted to tell me everything over the phone. What she told me blew my fucking mind. Excuse my language, but this cunt was the biggest narcissist, pathological liar, cheating scumbag I had ever had the displeasure of knowing. He had lied about it all. He was 36, born and raised by his mom and dad in Brazil his entire life. He had brothers, not 4 sisters. He'd never lived in Portugal, and Grandma was still alive and kicking. He studied social work and was now studying to become a physiotherapist. Nothing to do with Arrow whatever the fuck. I didn't even know what the shipping container place had to do with any of this, but he'd sent me Insta stories of him working there, so that is kind of scary. He was the same charming, suave man to his ex-wife, who he married in Brazil, and they moved to Queensland shortly after. As soon as they arrived, he became financially and emotionally abusive to her and refused to get a job. She worked and paid all the bills, his social work degree included, random business trips, and whatever else the scumbag pretended that he did. Side note, please don't try to find her. She would like to remain anonymous as she is scared of her ex-husband and what he's capable of. After being in Queensland for 5 years, she got a message from a 24-year-old Australian girl, the same age as me at the time, and it turned out they'd been dating for 3 years. They'd met at uni, and he'd been using her to do all his university work. She was told the same life story as me, but the poor thing never questioned it. She believed the crap about his age, too. She realized through a mutual uni friend that saw a photo of him and said that she thought he was married. Thank fuck for that friend. So Wilton and his wife got divorced, and the 24-year-old kicked him to the curb. But only a year later, another girl reached out to his now ex-wife. Same story. 24-year-old Australian girl told the same bullshit life story, and she believed it too. They'd been together 4 years, and he was using her to pay for his lifestyle and clothes. 2 years went by. His ex-wife just hoped that he had finally come to his senses, but afraid not. I was the 3rd girl to reach out to her. My guess is he's still got a few girls on the go at a time. His plans probably kept changing because of them, and one of them probably pays for his plane trips every few weeks. Fuck, the holiday, jewelry, and lingerie was probably some other woman's hard-earned money as well. Needless to say, I was furious. I ended up ghosting him because that's the best way to piss off a narcissist. He messaged me for weeks on text, Instagram, WhatsApp, and Facebook. Eventually, I decided to give him a taste of his own medicine. I told him that I knew some things, and he needed to come clean. I never mentioned what or how I knew, but he said he'd be fully transparent and fly down to Melbourne to see me. He probably thought I knew 1% of the truth. I thought about actually seeing him and seeing what bullshit he'd come up with next, but I was done. I told him I was about 5 hours from the city in a town that's so small there's only one train to get there a day. I said I couldn't pick him up from the airport, but he could stay a few days. I'd show him the real Australian country, and then I'd drive him back to the airport at the end of his visit. So after catching a 2.5-hour flight and sitting on a train for 5 hours to go to the middle of nowhere, I asked him to send a photo of where he was so I could find him. He actually did it. Me? I was at home in my pajamas watching a movie, and he was at a train station in the rain, 5 fucking hours away from the airport, and stuck until the next day. Pure gold. I can only imagine how pissed he was. I sent him a message that I would be ready and waiting for that exact moment. I waited for a reply, so I knew he got it. Then I blocked the piece of shit on everything and never looked back. So there you go. Stay safe out there and always trust your instincts. Years ago, I posted this on a Melbourne forum, and unfortunately there were a lot of girls that had met him online or for a date, but thankfully they all got the same vibes as me before it went too far. However, I was the only one crazy enough to find out who the scumbag really was. I just hope he hasn't been able to trick anyone anymore since my run-in with him. And if they have been, I hope they find out the truth. If you somehow find this asshole on the streets or online, do as you please. Just please don't contact his ex-wife for her protection. Thanks for coming on this journey with me. Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. If you have a true scary story you'd like me to narrate, email it to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. If you could take a minute and give a thumbs up to this video, that would be awesome, but only do it if you liked it. Leave a comment below, I'd love to know what you thought of the stories. And if you haven't considered doing it, why not become a subscriber? Follow me on social media, and if you'd like to take your support of the channel even further, find a link to my Patreon page in the description, as well as a link to my TeePublic storefront, and maybe get some Uncle Josh and Campfire Crew merchandise. I'm telling you guys, they make swell holiday gifts. Still looking for any scary holiday stories that you have, and we're getting pretty close to Christmas, guys, so get your stories in now. I'd love to read them and share them with everyone. Everyone, be excellent to each other. And until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.